first glance, Challengers seems like a pretty familiar story. 2 men, 1 woman, a messy love triangle set in the intense world of competitive tennis. The trailer leans into this idea hard. Dramatic stares, jealous rivalries, a central question: which man will she choose? But once you actually watch the film, something strange happens. Because the tension that drives Challengers doesn't feel like it's about the woman at all. Instead, the film lingers on bodies, rivalry, and the emotional intimacy between the 2 men. The relationship, competitive, obsessive, and maybe even romantic, often feels like the real center of the story. While Challengers is crafted through a queer lens focused on erotic, athleticism, and homosocial desire, its promotional campaign repackages this intimacy into a heterosexual love triangle drama, revealing how mainstream marketing often masks queer media for mass consumption. Which raises an interesting question. Why was this film marketed as a heterosexual love triangle when the movie itself feels so intensely queer? Hollywood loves a good love triangle. It's one of the most recognizable narrative structures in mainstream film. Usually it follows a simple formula. 1 woman stands between 2 men. One is the safer choice, one is the exciting one. The story revolves around which man she's ultimately going to choose. But Challengers doesn't really follow these rules. Let's break down the characters. First, there's Tashi Duncan, played by Zendaya. Tashi is a former tennis prodigy turned coach. She's strategic, calculating, and obsessed with the game itself. In marketing material, she is framed as the center of this love triangle, the object of desire both men compete for. But in the film, Tashi's true passion isn't romance, it's tennis. And then there's Art Donaldson, played by Mike Feist. Art represents stability. He's careful, disciplined, and emotionally grounded. If there were a traditional love triangle, he would clearly be the safe choice. Art values longevity over passion, rarely making mistakes. Art is the ice of this relationship. Contrasting Art, there's Patrick Zweig, played by Josh O'Connor. Patrick is chaotic, flirtatious, impulsive, and the passionate rival who disrupts everything. Patrick follows quick fixes and is moved by passion at all times. Patrick is the fire in this relationship. If the story followed the traditional formula, the narrative would revolve around which man Tashi ultimately chooses. Is her heart with the fire or the ice? But that's not what really happens, because the emotionally charged relationship in the film isn't between Tashi or either of the men. It's between Art and Patrick. They start as best friends and doubles partners. Their bond is intense, competitive, and deeply personal. Oftentimes, that connection becomes fractured by jealousy, ambition, desire. And the film never fully clarifies what their relationship actually is. Friends, enemies, something more? The ambiguity is deliberate and deeply queer. So if the film itself is so ambiguous and queer in tone, why did the marketing focus so heavily on a straight love triangle? Part of the answer lies with the director's history. Luca Guadagnino has built a career around stories that explore desire, intimacy, and sexuality in unconventional ways. His film Call Me By Your Name tells a coming-of-age story about a romantic relationship between 2 men in Italy unable to be together. Bones and All explores intimacy and alienation through a strange and deeply emotional relationship of 2 cannibalistic outcasts. And the film Queer adapts one of the most famous queer novels of the 20th century, exploring longing, addiction, and queer identity in the 1950s. So Guadagnino's filmmaking style already carries a strong queer sensibility. So when Guadagnino directs a movie about 2 male athletes whose relationship is defined by obsession, rivalry, and intimacy, it's not surprising that queer films appear again. But if you only saw the marketing for Challengers, you might not guess that. Look at the official posters. Almost every single one of them centers Tashi directly between the 2 men. The visual composition literally forms a triangle, Zendaya in the middle with Mike Feist and Josh O'Connor positioned on either side. The layout sends a specific message. 2 men are rivals, the woman is the prize. But the marketing doesn't rely on the imagery, it also relies on narrative framing. The trailers emphasize romantic conflict between the 3 characters, lingering shots of Zendaya looking between the 2 men, dramatic confrontations, a dialogue that suggests jealousy and betrayal. The structure is designed to make audience think they already understand the story. It looks like a familiar Hollywood formula. But this framing also serves another purpose. It makes the film easy to sell. Romantic triangles are extremely recognizable marketing tools. They immediately communicate the stakes, conflict, and emotional drama in just a few seconds. And when studios invest millions of dollars into a film's release, marketing teams often rely on these familiar narrative shortcuts. And there's another factor to play here: star power. Zendaya is by far one of the most recognizable names on the cast. Because of that, the promotional campaign heavily centers around her character and narrative focus. Even the tagline of the film, "Her game, her rules," positions Tashi at the central figure controlling the story. But ironically, this emphasis can obscure the film's real emotional dynamics. The marketing frames the story as a heterosexual romance, but the film itself constantly redirects our attention towards male intimacy, rivalry, and desire. This creates a fascinating contradiction. In other words, the marketing simplifies the story into something familiar, but the film itself remains far more complicated. And this isn't unusual. Throughout film history, studios have often marketed queer-coded films in ways that downplay or obscure their queer elements in order to reach wider audiences. Sometimes that means removing queer storylines entirely. Other times, like Challengers, it means reframing the narrative so that queer tension becomes the secondary to the more conventional romantic plot. The result is a film that can be interpreted in many ways, but is initially introduced to audience through a much safer and more traditional way. But once the film actually starts, it becomes clear that the emotional core of the story lies somewhere else entirely. Throughout the movie, the camera lingers on the male body in ways that feel deliberately erotic. Sweat, muscle, heavy breathing during matches. One of the earliest moments that directly points at the film's queer undertones is the infamous churro scene. At first, it looks like a simple bonding moment between two teenage tennis players, Art and Patrick side by side, sharing food and joking around after a match. But the way the scene is filmed tells a slightly different story. The camera lingers on the small gestures between them. Patrick leaning in, Art watching him closely, the casual intimacy of sharing the same churro. The moment feels playful, but strangely intimate. What's interesting is the interaction happens before Tashi becomes a major presence in their dynamic. The closeness between the two men already exists. The nickname hotel room scene pushes that tension even farther. In this moment, Tashi sits between Art and Patrick as they flirt, joke, and challenge each other. On the surface, this is a classic seduction scene, one woman surrounded by two men who both want her. But the blocking of the scene, the ways the characters are physically positioned, creates something more complicated. Tashi isn't the object of desire. She's almost orchestrating the dynamic between the two men. As the tension builds, Patrick and Art end up kissing her, but they're also inches away from each other. The moment is charged not just with heterosexual desire, but the possibility of something else. The camera frames their faces close together, creating a sense that the kiss is almost shared between all three characters. Tashi even encourages the tension between them, resulting in the only kiss between Art and Patrick, almost like she's testing the chemistry that already exists between the two men. In this sense, the scene functions less like a traditional love triangle and more like a moment of queer experimentation, a brief moment where the boundaries between friendship, rivalry, and desire blur together. But the film's most revealing moment comes during the final tennis match. On paper, the match should be a professional competition. Art and Patrick are playing for victory, career advancement, and pride. But emotionally, the match feels more personal. Throughout the sequence, the camera cuts between their faces, their breathing, their bodies moving across the court. Editing builds tension not just as a sports competition, but almost a physical confrontation between the two people who share years of unresolved emotional history. Their rivalry becomes intensely intimate. The way they watch each other, the way they anticipate each other's movements, the way the match begins to feel like less of a game and more like a private conversation between them. By the end of the match, the tension reaches its breaking point when the two men collide into the net, collapsing into each other. Instead of separating immediately, they embrace. For a moment, the rivalry disappears. The physical closeness between them becomes the emotional climax of the entire film. And notably, the moment happens without Tashi on the court. This resolution of the story occurs between the two men themselves, and the ambiguity between rivalry, intimacy, and desire is what gives Challengers its distinctly queer reading. The tennis court becomes a space where athletic competition transforms into something much more intimate. This is what some critics call erotic athleticism, the idea that physical competition can be a site of desire. And in Challengers, the relationship between Art and Patrick drives that tension. Lingering eye contact, emotional confrontation, physical closeness that borders flirtation. The film constantly places them in situations where competition and intimacy blur together. Tashi, meanwhile, often feels like the catalyst rather than the center. She pushes the men into competition, she manipulates their rivalry, she keeps the game going. But the emotional intensity between the two men never really disappears. Instead, the film leaves their relationship unresolved, hovering somewhere between friendship, obsession, and attraction. Challengers was released, audience immediately picked up on the tension between Art and Patrick. Online discussions quickly shifted away from the love triangle narrative and towards the relationship between the two men. On platforms like TikTok, Twitter, and Reddit, fans created edits under the hashtag #ArtTrick description and discussions framing Art and Patrick as a romantic pairing, highlighting moments of jealousy, obsession, and physical contact as evidence of their suppressed desire. For many viewers, the film's energy felt unmistakably queer, but not everyone agreed on what that meant. Some critics argued that Challengers was engaging in queerbaiting, the idea of modern media suggesting queer tension without fully committing to it. From that perspective, the film teases the possibility of romantic connection between the two men, but ultimately avoids confirming it. This made the movie itself deeply controversial upon release. However, that interpretation may overlook the way Guadagnino often approaches storytelling. Instead of clearly labeling relationships or identities, his films frequently focus on the desire as something fluid and ambiguous. The emotional tension between the characters is often more important than defining exactly what kind of relationship they have. In this sense, the ambiguity of Challengers might not be a trick played on the audience. It is actually the point. Understand why the marketing of Challengers feels so different from the film itself, it helps to zoom out and look at the history of queer cinema more broadly. For much of the 20th century, queer stories were either completely absent from Hollywood films or heavily censored. Because of this, filmmakers that wanted to explore queer themes had to do so indirectly. Instead of showing explicitly queer relationships, movies relied on coded characters, subtext, and implication. A lingering glance, a suggestive line of dialogue, or a relationship that felt emotionally charged but never explicitly romantic could all signal queerness to the audiences who were paying attention. The legacy of that kind of coded storytelling remained. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, independent filmmakers began pushing queer stories more towards the mainstream through movements like the New Queer Cinema. Directors associated with this movement rejected sanitized portrayals of LGBTQ characters and instead created films that were messy, political, and unapologetically queer. But mainstream Hollywood has always been slower to embrace those kind of stories. Even today, major studio films often present queer narratives in ways that feel slightly ambiguous or softened for wider audiences. This is where Challengers becomes interesting. Unlike many earlier films, the queerness of Challengers doesn't come from explicit dialogue or identity labels. Instead, it emerges through the visual language and emotional dynamics, the charged rivalry between Art and Patrick, the sensual framing of athletic bodies, and the unresolved intimacy that builds throughout the film. But the difference today is that audiences are much more aware of these patterns. Viewers are quick to recognize when a film is engaging in queer themes, even when the themes aren't explicitly stated. That's why so many viewers interpreted the relationship between Art and Patrick as the center of the film's emotional core. In a way, Challengers exists at a crossroads of queer cinema. It reflects the legacy of earlier films that had to communicate queerness indirectly, while also existing in the media landscape where audiences are increasingly ready to recognize and discuss those dynamics openly. On the surface, the film's promotional campaign tells a simple story, a woman caught between two men in a dramatic love triangle. But once the film begins, the narrative starts to unravel. Desire moves across the court, just as the tennis ball does. But the film's marketing never quite acknowledged that possibility. It's a film where the camera invites us to see the desire in unexpected places, while the marketing tries to guide us towards a much simpler interpretation. And that tension between subtext, visibility, and marketability is exactly what makes the film such an interesting case for queer media today.